Hello, and welcome to the Package Monthly ThinkBIG meeting. This is where we talk about topics that are maybe a little bit further out, maybe in the 3 to 6 or 9 month time window. Today we have a full agenda, so I will jump right in if that's okay. Okay, so the first item on the list, I pasted an issue that was shared with me and with the whole product team from the product leadership team. This issue is really about, if you've been here, actually this whole team has been here long enough that for a long time we've been focusing on breadth over depth as sort of the GitLab strategy. We put a huge emphasis on adding net new features and categories. With this issue that Scott shared around last week and we reviewed yesterday in the product meeting, we want to shift towards depth over breadth. So we should be focusing on usability and depending on which group you're in, either driving group monthly active users or paid group monthly active users. So for us, we are one of the 20% of stages that should be focused on just driving non-paid usage activity or Gmail. So that's kind of going to be the big shift that we make. And the implications of that probably are I think we've been kind of going this route for the past several milestones already, but I bring it up here so that we're all aware that this is the corporate direction. And then also to maybe bring up a topic of like, what should we improve? We all use the product every day. Are there particular areas or use cases that when you're using them, it's quite frustrating? And should we resolve those? And I'll pause there. Any questions? Cool. So I'll say that the next thing that I was thinking about is the problem that I'm having, and maybe the other reason that I brought this up is we could track monthly active users, but that doesn't really give us a sense of if the changes that we're making to user experience are working. So I opened an issue to measure some additional data points. Things like for me, a frustrating experience is when I go to publish an NPM package and I get the 4.1 error because I forgot to change the version. And it doesn't tell me that that's why the error failed or something like that. Or it's really frustrating if I am in a merge request and I see that I tried to apply a suggestion and it doesn't work. So I think if we could start to measure how frequently those events occur, then we could try to reduce the amount of times that they occur, although we'll never get to 0, I'm sure. And then we could test different things. That's at least the initial idea that I had. So I open that up to questions or comments. So everything makes sense and there's no frustrating experiences of using GitLab. All right, should we move on to the next topic?
I just wanted to call out that the work we've been doing on the UI and refining it, the cleanup policies and the work we did with Suzanne, as well as what Nico and I have been working on just the flat UI, has already been used as examples of how to switch from breadth to depth and refining and iterating. So other parts of the organization are seeing that we're already ahead of the curve. So our team is wonderful, and I'd like everyone to make sure they know that they are awesome.
Thank you, Ian.
It's one thing I would be kind of curious about. I don't know if you've looked into it yet, is like there's the frustrations over sort of like something not working as expected or being more difficult to figure out. But I'm curious with certain package types, like the level of frustration of, not having that sort of like full implementation, like there's missing commands of NPM or whatever package type, or there's missing, like stuff that maybe not every user uses, but that if you use packages a lot, you're like, why can't I do this thing that you can do on NPM or on one of the other package types? I'm curious about that as well.
I think that would, within reason, would fall under us trying to improve our product and drive more usage, would be to like increase the usefulness or number of use cases of the product. There's probably a line there to say that we don't want to recreate NPM, but I think that those are the kinds of issues that we should be investing in. Not just, oh, I got an error and this is a frustrating experience, but more so like, I think the virtual registries is a good example, because that's something that's like, it's useful, and we could add another package manager format, or we could make NPM or Maven have, you know, this concept of virtual registries, and we could add more functionality around that. So I think that falls under things we would want to do that would drive usage to our existing features and categories. What we wouldn't want to do necessarily is open up whole new categories at this point. We wouldn't want to say like, well, let's tackle RPM right now, for instance.
Cool.
Yes. Okay, I can move on to the next agenda item, which is a quick one. So Ian and I have, you know, I think everybody knows there's this corporate push to get away from direct messages and move everything into public channels. And prior to that push, Ian and I would have like sort of a running conversation in our private channel that we've tried to move to this S package strategy channel. And now it's been going for about a week. We'd like to share it with everybody else. If you'd like to join, feel free. No, it's not obligatory. But if you want to see some of the UX and product conversations that Ian and I are having, you could feel free to join. Okay. Ian, you want to take the next item?
Yes. So our traditional research update for ThinkBIG. We have two big initiatives for research in flight right now. The first is unmoderated testing for this, that is for solution validation for the cleanup policies. Changing up the verbiage in the UI, making sure that it actually makes sense to our users compared to before where there were some struggles. I've included in the agenda the research issue itself, as well as something that's pretty cool. Our team in this research initiative is going to pilot using a new tool called usertesting.com to facilitate unmoderated testing. This is really great in a lot of ways. It opens up our schedules. It's more in line with GitLab's asynchronous nature. So the basis of it is that instead of me scheduling a time with the user, asking them questions and making them do things and then responding in real time, we put out a test that is kind of guided through the tool, and then they perform the task and it's all recorded, and then I just have to synthesize the recording afterwards. We have 16 participants that are going to go through this process, 8 of which are being recruited through our normal channels, so utilizing Emily and the research recruitment team. And then the other 8 are being pulled in through usertesting.com's panel. I actually just checked, all 8 of them have already done their tests. So it took less than 8 hours to get 8 tests done. And I think Tim can agree with this. Usually doing scheduled moderated testing, that's like a 3-week process to schedule it and get them done. So to get that feedback in under a day is pretty awesome. I'm hoping that by next week we'll have all of them, including through our traditional recruiting, done and can synthesize the results. And that way we can create a formal issue for changing the verbiage in the UI for those cleanup policies, because we know our users have been frustrated with that. Before I move on to the next research, does anybody have any questions about that?
You know, would you consider sharing the video you created for the usertesting.com pilot in here? I thought it was really cool to watch.
Yes, I can, but not right now because I'm not that fast on Slack.
Yeah.
Yes, I shared a recording of me taking the test myself, so you can kind of see what it's like. It pops up with a little UI that says, here's a task we want you to complete. And then you go and do it and hit next, and it kind of guides you that way. I can definitely share that out. Any other questions or thoughts? Cool. The next one I'm really excited about. We did solution validation of the dependency proxy. This was classic in-person moderated testing. This is a big deal because this was validating an entire category and the direction we want to take it and make sure it actually works for our users. And we heard from several different customers that a lack of these features is stopping them from moving over to GitLab's package tools, or is creating restrictions that they're not sure how to deal with. So finding out if what we want to put together will actually help them was really important. We had 5 participants go through the solution validation interview. They were all focused in the DevOps area and tended to be either senior engineers, DevOps engineers, system admins, or at the kind of VP of engineering level. So more on the high level, and we didn't test as many just straight developers as we have in other tests before. One of the reasons we stopped at 5 is that we got insanely consistent results. Specifically the languages, the package formats that they used, the size of the organization, the size of the individual teams, the number of teams didn't seem to have any impact on how they felt about the feature, which is really great because that means the feature is designed in a way to help all of those kinds of combinations of users. So that's another reason we stopped at 5, is we just kept getting the same results. So there wasn't much of a need to move outside of that. Some of the highlights that I wanted to go over, I'm still in the middle of synthesizing all the results and creating the insights in Dovetail. The unmoderated testing kind of popped up, and so my timing is a little bit off. That's why it's not done yet. I will get them done and share them all formally with everyone. But the big ones are, overall, the solution was positively received. All of the participants at the very end of it, after being given the scenario and having gone through the task, got the blanket question of, if this solution was available today, would it help your organization? All of them said yes. They all explained in details why they thought it would be helpful. Some of them were that we make it so that the individual developers don't have to worry about where their packages are. We solve it for them. We solve it consistently, so we don't have, I think one person said 7,000 copies of Express in every different registry because this problem wasn't solved yet. So overall, we were in the right direction. The user interface for the dependency proxy and the data that we were presenting was consistently well understood. I asked each user at each screen to say, walk me through everything you see. All of what they responded with was accurate in terms of what the data meant, how it was relevant, how to work with the interactions. So that part was really sound, which is really great. One of the most important things I learned from the users is that caching is incredibly important. And I think 4 of the 5 participants called out specifically that when npm.js.org goes down, their pipelines stop building and they have to kind of wait until the registry pops back up. That's not the only example, but that was the one that they kept using. So that's something, may not be the MVC, and the remote and virtual registries is the first step, but being able to cache those things to increase that level of stability is pretty important to all of them. The registry limit, right now you are only allowed to add 10 registries to the virtual registry. This is for performance, and David has a lot of really great insight as to why that is. But we talked to our users, and they all said that probably will work except in these situations. And for one of them, it flat wouldn't work. They needed more registries involved. However, when we kind of dug into it a little bit more with some of the participants, we learned that if hosted registries were excluded from that count, or if they could utilize a group level registry endpoint instead of each individual hosted registry, that would likely prevent this, because all of their teams have their own registries, which is great. And then they have an archive and some over here, and then they have the default that they need to pull their public packages from. And that shrunk the number a lot. The story we usually heard was, I have already created 150 projects, and if each one of them created a package with the goal of being able to share those packages throughout the entire organization, I blew that 10 number right out of the water. So I think there's some playroom. I've already shared this with David, and he has some ideas and thoughts around it. So I think it's a solvable problem, but want to make sure everyone's aware. Some of the terms that we use cause some confusion, specifically when we decide to call it a virtual registry, a remote registry, a hosted registry, and the dependency proxy. This could just be that they didn't have any context. 2 of them even called out, before I would get started, I would go read the documentation to understand how GitLab solves this problem. So it could be just the test not giving them that context, but we should be aware and very explicit and clear about what each of those terms mean and how they impact the result. 2 of the users expected the dependency proxy to simply have one URL that you could pull anything from. I think If I understood correctly, this is similar to how Artifactory works. I don't know. I think that's what they said. And so if I pulled from NPM, it would be intelligent enough to only check NPM registries to get their packages. And there was only one URL for every package format, which is a little different than how we set it up. Some of the participants, that didn't phase them and they preferred the segmented URL, but I just wanted to call out that some users had that expectation out of the gate. The vanity URLs was a little feature that we included in there just to find out how users would feel about it and if it was important to them. They thought it was cool, they understood the idea, but it certainly wasn't a deal breaker or a heavily sought after feature for any of them. I will say that the larger the organization got, the more interested they became in the vanity URL, which I thought was an interesting correlation. From the largest participant, the participant of the largest organization that we talked to, this was more of we have 2,000 engineers and they don't want to have to think about or remember where this URL came from. And so if I could add a vanity, it would make sense. Smaller organizations, it seemed like they could just go directly to whatever place this was and find that themselves. So the vanity aspect wasn't as important. I will have several more insights and specifics and stuff that I can share, and I will add them to the research issue and publicize that so everyone can see all of the details. But these were the big highlights that kind of stood out. That was a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the research around this awesome feature?
I would actually, oh, sorry, as a new person, I would kind of love to, I would love if you could help me define those terms, because I've had that when Tim's mentioned virtual registry too, I've gone like, oh, I wonder what that is. So if, I don't know if I should open an issue or what's the best way, because I would like to make sure the documentation has those definitions like you said.
For sure. The next step, once I'm done synthesizing the results, we're going to partner with David, and I'm assuming David, the engineers, I should be a little more open, and yourself and Nico and I to figure out how to break down, because this was a very large, way out of the scale of an MVC test. And so breaking it down into its smallest pieces. So there may be an issue dedicated to creating a virtual registry, and we should definitely have a conversation of define this in the documentation. This is what the UI says it is. This is how we expand on it, all of that. I totally agree. I think it's really important.
Did any of the users, like when they were confused by some of the names, say, oh, okay, that's like this, and have like their own name for it that they were used to?
I really wanted them to, but they didn't. The ones that were confused really didn't expect that the virtual registry and the dependency proxy were two different entities, one being inside of the other. They expected the dependency proxy to be the one URL. And so the idea of a virtual registry just kind of confused them. And so they thought a virtual registry was an artificial connection to a remote. Posing as a hosted registry is how they kind of explained it. And then when I offered up the remote registry, they were like, well, that's nothing. That means nothing to me. However, once we went through the tests, these were pretty easy for users to overcome. And as we went through the tests and got to the end, it all made sense by the end. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, this could be a problem that is simply solved by being very clear, having sound documentation, and even just marketing and talking about the features as we introduce them very accurately to kind of teach our users as we start building them. But no, none of them were like, oh, that's this thing, and then we could change it and everyone would understand what we wanted. I was hoping for that. It didn't happen.
A few words on the limit of 10. I use that limit on the analysis to have something, I guess. The idea is to not be able to have an infinite list of registries within the virtual one, so that we have an application limit. So I'm pretty confident that we can scan hosted registries really quickly in a few SQL queries. So I guess we can bump that number. The most important limit would be the remote registries, because it's a network request. within another network request, since this whole list scanning or searching for packages will happen when a CLI tool will try to pull a package. So you are within a request. So yeah, I guess we can do something around that, where we would be analyzing the list, and if we have several hosted registries together, we can just query the database in, I guess, 1 or 2 queries to have all the, well, to find the package within those registries, and that would be very, very fast. So I'm pretty positive that we can bump this limit much higher. The one I guess we will need some data is the one that is for the remote registries. I think we selected 3 as a limit, and I guess that's a good start. But then perhaps we can bump that or not. It will depend on the how we can connect to the remote registry and how we handle things.
Thanks for sharing that. I think if we can either find a way to exclude the hosted registries or count them all as one, and then limit the number of remote registries and then have a default, that will meet, I'm going to say 95% of what our users are expecting and stay within that realm. The big one that I heard multiple times is my team is moving over to microservices and we have a more dispersed team. And so we're just going to have inside our organization will have more registries. That's why I think moving the hosted out of that count will really alleviate a lot of the pressure of that number.
You mentioned that one solution could be using the group registry instead of the project hosted registry. Is that?
One user brought that up as if I just had one endpoint for every hosted registry inside my organization, that would solve this. That could be an easy solution. I don't want to get technical because that's not my wheelhouse at all. But one of the concerns that comes up in my mind is if you have packages that have the same name in different hosted registries inside of a group endpoint, how do we handle that? So if one team produces a package that has the same name as a different team produced it, one of them is supposed to be the priority. How do we identify that? That could be not an issue that nobody actually has, and so I'm creating problems out of nowhere. But that's my one hesitation with that group level endpoint.
It would be a problem for anywhere where we don't already have a group endpoint, I think. Because like if someone's already using the Maven group endpoint, then we don't allow duplicates. But if like for NPM, we don't have a group endpoint, so then it's likely that there might be duplicates across projects.
I'd be curious because I feel like it's one of those things where right now all we hear about is we want the drop of naming restrictions. So I'm curious if when we do that, if we would see an increase of like, oh, we need to handle conflicts, because right now nobody is saying that they would have a problem with the conflicts, but it's also not an option at this point.
Can we investigate that? Can we look into the database and like look for how many packages have the same name and scope, or like the same, are in the same group and have the same name?
We could, yeah, I could probably put together some queries to see, like, you know, in different scopes, how many have similar or shared names, so we can kind of get an idea of if we did just say, you know, whoever gets this name has it, how often we would get those conflicts.
I'm going to be that process person and ask either Steve or Tim to make an issue and add the ThinkBIG label.
I can make the issue since Steve's going to actually have to write and run the query.
Perfect. Any other thoughts on the dependency proxy research? before we move on to the next thing?
For the vanity URL, they also could have a custom vanity URL within their organization. So imagine that I'm working at the company foobar.net. I could create an alias registry.foobar.net that would be just be a redirect to the virtual registry URL. But that's within their infrastructure, not ours. So that's a thought. And I lost everyone.
Can you say that again? Because I was trying to paste something into the doc. Sorry.
On the vanity URLs, they could implement that on their side within their DNS servers. You can add an alias on their DNS, and they can map that on the virtual registry URL, and so they could have npm.foobar.net as the URL for the virtual registry within GitLab. So that's also an option for them.
That's a really cool idea, and kind of fits with the idea that it's the larger organizations that have the infrastructure and staff to be able to make those aliases easily are the ones that want or most interested in that endpoint. So that could be a way for us to not actually implement the feature, but still connect them with that flexibility. That's a cool idea.
It's really similar to, I'm sure that GitLab pages do that too, where you have documentation on how you can set up your own custom URL for your blog, but your blog is actually hosted on GitLab pages. So it's a simple alias, I guess, in your DNS server, and that's it. And they could be doing the same here for the virtual registry URL.
Now I
That
caught
is so
all
cool.
of it. I caught all of that. Thank you, David. Thank you for repeating it.
Yeah, you have to write very clever docs to make it seem like this is a GitLab thing, but then when they finished, they realized it was all somewhere else. They did it all by themselves.
I think we have a fun challenge for Suzanne when we get to that point. Make it feel like a GitLab feature, even though it was entirely their own job. All right, any other thoughts before we move on? All right, Tim, I think you have the next one.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a continuation of this conversation, I guess. So in a couple of milestones ago, we conducted an investigation and the design issue, and now that's powered a lot of the insights that Ian just shared. And so I'm wondering now, as we start to think about how to actually start building this, maybe we could just have a conversation about what's the best way to get started. And that could be opening issues, that could be, you know, talking through the MR plan. I'll sort of leave that up to everybody else.
I have a question. As we start talking about building this, is this something that we have to build a version of for each package manager? Or is this something that we build it for, we create the content of a virtual registry and it just applies to everything on its own? Or is it a mix of those two things?
So the models and all the logic in the backend would be the same for all the package types. But then what would be different is the URL, well, the API endpoint for the virtual registry, because each package manager has its own set of URLs you need to implement so that you can support the pull package action. So if you want, it's like Maven will do this request to pull a package, npm will do this request to pull a package. And we need to implement those differences within the virtual registry endpoint so that it supports each package manager. But apart from that, everything will be shared and centralized so that we don't have many, I don't know, how do you want to call that? Virtual registries, engines, or whatever. It's just a single one because the logic is always the same. You just scan through the whole list and you just look for packages. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you. Does that mean the first step would be to create remote registries for X package manager? Like pick one and say, all right, we are now going to set up remotes that you can pull from and then get a new GitLab URL that you can just kind of cycle everything through?
Well, the plan I did in the analysis was more about starting from the database and you just start building the blocks you will need and just start building things on top of them. And the last step would be to implement this endpoint for virtual registries for each package manager. Well, obviously we will choose one for the first iteration, but if you implement the API without having all the logic and all the models behind, you just are implementing an empty shell, I guess, an empty endpoint. So that's not super valuable, I guess. So that's why it should be better to start with the database and just start building what you need in the database. Then you jump into the services layer where the logic of the whole thing would live. And then these services would be used by the endpoint directly.
What would it be like for someone to help contribute? Like if let's say we were working on Maven first, and someone wanted to help add support for NuGet. How far along in that plan do we have to be before we can have sort of stand up the scaffolding for someone else to contribute if they'd like?
Ideally, we would need to have the first virtual registry for a given type implemented so that we have all the pieces implemented. And then it would be just a matter to, okay, I will implement the virtual registry for Maven. And so I need to implement those URLs and connect the endpoints to the existing services.
It sounds like the actual, like the Maven implementation is the top of the iceberg. And everything that needs to go underneath it, the database and the APIs are all generalized. And
yeah, it's I don't. Well, perhaps I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that there are ways to parallelize everything in a vertical way. You really need to do in a horizontal way where you need to, okay, first the database layer, then the service layer, then the API layer, and that's it. But having something that would, yeah, okay, let's implement the model, the service, and the API for this side of the feature. No, I'm not sure that this will be working, because if you create a virtual registry and you implement the logic, you will need to handle hosted and remote registries so that you can implement the scanning loop. And if you don't have the models, well, what are you going to handle within the loop? So yeah, it's not a small feature, and that's a lot of pieces, but we need all of them. The bright side is that once we have all the pieces, it should be pretty easy to add support for other package types.
Shouldn't have said that last part. Sorry.
But when it comes to, I mean, like I'm looking at the MR plan in that issue. When it comes to, because there's a lot of MRs and there's obviously a lot of work to get that initial big structure. Can any of that be parallelized like within the team, or do you think it's kind of like one person's just gonna have to like really dig in for a month or two and like crank all the MRs out to get everything initially set up?
I think I did something like that just below. So the GraphQL MRs could be left for a side, I guess, and we could, not for a side, but they could be implemented in parallel. So someone can be working on the models and the services, and well, the models would be the base to everything. So we need the models. Once we have that, we can have someone on the services and someone on the GraphQL APIs. And then the virtual registry API can also be implemented at once the service layer is done. So that could be also be done while the GraphQL API is implemented. So there are a few ways within the team to parallelize things, but we are not going to cut that. The models, we will need all of them. The services, we will need all of them before implementing the virtual registry endpoint. And well, obviously the GraphQL API can't work without the models. So the models are really the base of everything.
So is the next step for me to look at that MR plan and then to create issues for each MR and then to start slotting those into upcoming milestones?
Yeah, we can. One thing that is not present is that once we have the GraphQL API, we can start the effort on the front end, because the front end will be using the GraphQL API. And this front end effort is not estimated in this plan. Nico, where are you? But having said that, we can implement the models, the services, and the virtual registry endpoint and just start playing with that by creating the virtual registries, hosted registries, and remote ones within the Rails console, and start playing with that and start looking at the endpoint, if it works properly or not, if we can add some things or not.
It sounds hard to get to an MVC in terms of like value, and it's not important that we have to deliver value first, but it sounds like there's a lot of groundwork or like foundational work that needs to be done before we can get to giving the user something, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One thing that we could do that would be valuable is just to share the process of what we're building and like how we're building it and communicate openly about that. I think that would be a way that we could show value and while we're working on that stuff, and it could be a good way to help people contribute in the future too, if we feel like we are interested in sharing that content.
Yeah, I was thinking, but perhaps it's a crazy idea. Once we have everything on the backend side, we could have some customers that are interested in, I don't know, alpha testing the feature, and we could have a virtual registry created through the Rails console on production. and so that they can start using it. That could be possible, but you wouldn't have any UI. But is that an MVC?
It could be for some people.
Yeah, it does remind me of, like, there are parts of our docs where, like, there's instructions for like admin style users to jump into the Rails console for their self-managed instance and configure things and add things, change settings. So we could set up, a portion of documentation of, like, set up some virtual repositories and then have some steps of how to do that through the console, and just invite users to try that out.
Well, in this case, all the GraphQL MRs can be seen as a part of the front-end support. So if we go that route, we don't need it in the first iteration, because we would just need the models, the services, and the virtual registry endpoint. And that's it. We could be starting using it with that. You don't need a GraphQL API for that.
With this, we've been talking about packages and Maven and NPM, but would this work also when we're ready, extend to the container registry? Could we also set up a remote and virtual registry for pulling images?
We could. I guess the whole logic about scanning for, well, I'm looking for this and just look at this list and try to find it. This logic can be centralized. Then I don't know if there is any shortcut for the implementation, since we have the dependency proxy that can be enabled. And so you can see all the requests before going to the container registry. That's a good question. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that we can centralize and have the logic once for all for packages and container registries, but then the models would be different, the GraphQL APIs would be different, and the virtual registry endpoint would be different, because we would need to implement the Docker client API.
That was going to be my question, kind of related. So the MR that you have listed, the API to pull packages, that's essentially adding what a given package manager client does to pull packages.
Yeah, exactly. You take, I don't know, the npm packages API, and you just extract the endpoints that npm needs to have to pull the package.
Right.
And well, for some it's just one endpoint. For others, I guess it's more than one. For Maven, I think it should be one. For Nugget, it's two, because you have the service and the service and index first. So it depends on the package manager. And well, the challenge here, and I guess that's why I put a 3 there, it's how do you put all these endpoints within the same grape class?
Yeah, and I think that one will probably get split by package type, probably one for each, and each one, like, the npm one might be a 1, whereas I don't want to think about what the Conan one, how many endpoints it might have.
Now that I'm saying this, I think I recall I put the virtual registries with the package type in the URL, so it can be mapped to different grape classes, so that you don't have a class handling all the virtual registries endpoint, which is similar to what we have for package registry at the project level where you have packages/npm.
So you think we'll be done by like 13.5 or?
The good question.
Yeah.
I think it's, well, what do you want for 35? Is it only the backend part?
Oh, I was mostly kidding. It would be good to do like just and I won't not holding us to this date at all, but let's say an MVC for Maven, where you can set up three remote registries and some hosted registries in a virtual registry, and it works without the front end, since we didn't estimate.
Okay. So we would need to remove all the GraphQL MRs, and well, that's hard to estimate.
3 milestones?
Well, not in one, that's for sure.
like one milestone for models and database MRs, maybe, and then one to get through a majority of the services, and then one to maybe finish services and add the polling API for Maven.
Are you counting one engineer on this or two?
What do you think I was
yeah, I guess
depends.
Three milestones is a
bit me or not.
I'm sorry. Do you want to work on virtual registries? Yeah, I guess 2 might be a bit tight. So perhaps to be on the safe side would be 3 milestones.
It's not bad. Yeah, it's pretty good. And so, I mean, even if it's 4 or 5, I think, but that's, this is going to be really valuable for our customers. I'm really excited to get these features out.
Potentially by the end of the year, we could have virtual registries for at least one package type, if not more.
That's very exciting. And let's say we fast forward to the end of the year and we didn't make it. Why do you think we would have not made it? Like what blockers would have come in our way, or like what can we do to make sure that is there anything else that's concerning you that maybe even outside of this project? Prioritization, I'm thinking of one thing, like try to not distract us from this. This will have to be our focus, right?
Well, there is one technical uncertainty around how do you contact an external service and how do you handle this request. So that would be for virtual registries. And because you need to, well, forward the request, get the response and forward it back to the client. But I guess you would need to implement a timeout, because if the remote registry is having some issues and it's going to take 30 seconds to answer you, well, we are not going to wait 30 seconds. So we will need to implement a kind of a timeout. So yeah, there are still a few details on the scanning loop that need to be, well, seen during the implementation.
Can we move those up? I know we mentioned maybe doing like the Maven request forwarding as an option earlier on, but would that help de-risk some of the timeout logic and requesting from external resources?
I just want to call out from a user perspective, just the request forwarding, even if it's as simple as similar to what we have with Docker, where it just pulls from Docker Hub, if we could pull any npm package from our hosted registries and then check npm.js.org. If it's not there, that amount of functionality would be valuable to our users. I've heard that kind of consistently, just as a tidbit.
Thanks, Ian. Can't tell if David's thinking and about to say something, or if he's.
Yeah, we're thinking if there are some things that could be, well, some hidden surprises. But I don't think that there is a lot of complexity. It's more on the amount of work we have to, well, amount of code we have to implement. It's like the GraphQL MRs, they are not hard or complex. They are quite simple to implement, but you need a lot of code to implement a GraphQL API. And probably here I just put one MR per model, but on the CRUD operation, you would split each operation in one MR. But other than that, yeah, I don't think that there is a really high technical complexity, but there is a lot of ground to cover.
I forget, the eventual addition beyond this will be to add a cache for the virtual repositories, the dependency proxy pretty much. I was just kind of thinking, I'm wondering if we need to keep that in mind with how we structure anything.
I'm not sure in terms of overall strategy, but that was a huge deal with our users, was caching. Especially if it is just, we check the registry, and if it fails for some reason, we have a cache to check. That would solve the stability issues that a lot of users are running into, and is one of the reasons that they're using some of our competitors, is that they have that feature set.
We can have a look at the dependency proxy, what we are doing for the container registry, since we have a cache there, and just get inspired by this, and perhaps we can reuse some code and have something centralized for that part.
And then when it comes to the virtual repository with eventual caching for remote repositories, if there's a user that says, I don't care about virtual repositories and all that, but I do want, you know, like NPM forwarding with caching, would that have to be separate, or, you know, is that something that we can kind of, you know, combine in a way that is still friendly for users? I'm just kind of speaking out or thinking out loud.
So right now we have the NPM request forward feature, which is similar to this, but in a way simpler implementation. We could implement caching in the virtual registries and in the request forward feature. That could be possible, and have something in common, because it's always the same thing. It's like, okay, I need this package from this registry, go fetch it. And the go fetch it logic would be, okay, first I will need to check the cache if there is something, and if there is nothing, I just will need to fetch it from the external registry, and then I will need to cache the response. And this is always the same thing. And that's why I'm mentioning the dependency proxy for the container registry, because it's it's really the same thing. Like, go fetch this blob, and this logic is, okay, let's check the cache. Is the blob present? No, okay, I will just fetch it from the container registry. Oh, I know I have this blob, I will put it to the cache and forward the response further. So yeah, I think we can do something to have the caching feature centralized in a common logic. But yeah, we can then add this caching aspect to the simple request forward feature that we have, which is the application setting.
From a user perspective, it sounds like we could build MVCs that are actually valuable instead of having to put everything together in building out the request forwarding for different package formats, adding caching to that. And then I wonder if we can then move to remote registries where it's not necessarily just the default we specified, but could be other registries, and start caching that. That would be valuable for users. And then we kind of postpone till the end the logic of combining them all together. Not my area of expertise. I'm just throwing out an idea.
I had this very same question. I think I asked it to Tim in an issue, which is, which path do we take? Do we go full bananas and we implement the virtual registry thing, or do we take a look at the request forward feature and we just support more package managers to this? We add more support to this feature, and on top of that we add caching. That's also a possibility, and it's actually a smaller path than the virtual registries, that's for sure.
I think my issue with that was the reason we did it for NPM is because for GitLab, you have to scope your packages specifically for the NPM registry. So it made it difficult for people to add in npm.com as a remote. Whereas with Maven and with the other remotes, you could pretty easily specify multiple remotes. It's not really as much of a challenge. You could just say, like, yeah, pull from GitLab, then pull from here. And so it's probably likely that most people have that set up already for Maven, and for some of the other ones. They don't get the caching, that's a big benefit. But it's likely that they already have that capability. That's why I didn't schedule the Maven issue. And I had someone, a couple of users mention the same thing about PyPI as well. So that's why I was thinking we go full bananas with methodically though. But I'm open to feedback and change, of course.
The total side question you just reminded me of with NPM. Does NPM, is it the client that restricts to using scopes, or is that us? Because I was wondering if we actually added project level endpoints for NPM, could we, allow users to publish packages without scopes?
I think if you're using a scope, then the client enforces it. But if you're not using this, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer exactly.
Okay, that's something to note to check into.
To me, the scopes were used because we have an instance level URL to pull the packages. So the backend has to have a way to locate the package. But if you're at the package level, at the project level, you already know where you are, so the backend can just check the packages. And so I guess it would be possible to drop the scope restriction for the project level API.
We went over. Thank you everyone for staying patient. I know good thing Dan wasn't here. I think he would have appreciated that. Okay, so next steps are I could create a bunch of issues based off of the investigation thread that we have open, and I'll basically just go through the MR plan and do my best to fill in the details. And then I'll share those issues in the channel once they're created. Anything we left out? I guess we probably owe Nico a bunch of front end issues too that have to be opened. I guess we could think about him. Anything we missed?
If we're planning the front end issues ahead of time, it would be good if you let me know when we make those so that I can make a design to match wherever we're at in terms of the iteration we're building towards. Because I don't think we could just hand Nico the design we put together and be like, build this.
For now, I'm going to focus on just the back end plan, and then we can create the front end
Perfect.
issues a little bit later.
Just one thought I had was it might actually be good to also do the whole like Rails console backend only implementation with some docs at first, because then you could even put in the docs all of the like screenshots of what the front end will look like, of like kind of like a coming soon, and then we can start to get feedback of, you know, I'm using this and this front end is going to be missing this thing or something to that extent before we even build it.
I really like that. I always like getting user feedback. That's wonderful.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This was great. It's really helpful. Another action item that I have is just to create an issue for understanding how prevalent duplicates are in the package registry. And I think that's it. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you all soon. Bye.